The 1968 Tet Mau Ton offensive, considered to be the turning point of the Vietnam War, was a large-scale offensive which ripped through the majority of South Vietnamese cities and towns. 84,000 Communist soldiers led the attack in the first phase of the offensive, and a combined total of at least 300,000, both National Liberation Front and People's Army of Vietnam, would eventually join in the attack over the next several months. 36 out of 44 provincial capitals, 5 out of 6 autonomous cities, and the capital, Saigon, was hit. At the heart of the Tet Offensive were two major battles, the Battle for Saigon and the Battle of Huế. The Battle of Saigon was highly publicized internationally, especially the communist attack at the American Embassy. However, within 2 weeks, by mid-February, all of the major locations in the city were secure. The embassy attack itself had been fully secured within 9 hours. Only sporadic fighting around Saigon would occur until NLF attacks stopped completely on March 8, 1968. It was the Battle of Huế that would eventually grow to be the epicenter of the Tet Offensive. Unlike Saigon, NLF and PAVN forces would manage to hold onto much of the city of Huế for an entire month, engaging Allied forces in house-to-house fighting. After 26 days of grueling urban combat, the Communists were forced out and the South Vietnamese government again controlled the city. Initial civilian casualties started to be tabulated. Out of a population of about 140,000, 944 civilians were killed, and 1,900 civilians were hospitalized as a direct result of combat. However, an additional 5,800 were marked as unaccounted for, about 4% of the population. On February 26, about a week before Huế was secured, a possible suggestion to the fate of the 5,800 was realized. In the Ya Hoi High School yard, 170 bodies were uncovered in numerous mass graves. It was instantly clear what had happened. A mass killing of civilians was uncovered. It was the fact that the Communists held the city of Huế for a long time that allowed it to commit one of the largest massacres, if not the largest massacre, of the Vietnam War. It could not really do this in any other South Vietnamese city or town during the Tet Offensive because it was pushed out of them far too quickly. But in Huế, Communist cadres had the time to execute Communist doctrine. Soon after the first discovery at Ya Hoi High School, many more mass graves were discovered in and around Huế during the subsequent months, the largest of which included 67 more bodies found at Đông Quang Tu Pagoda, 77 at Bai Yao Mulberry Fields, approximately 100 at Chợ Thông, 201 at the Imperial Nguyen Dynasty tombs, approximately 200 at Doi Vọng Cánh, and approximately 100 at Dom Ghi village. Pike reports that a total of 1,173 bodies would be found in the city area during this first wave of discoveries. Another contemporary report, Communist political executions at Huế in the 1968 Tet Offensive, a documented report, tentatively attributed to correspondent Joseph L. Dees by Vietnam War historian Edwin Moisey, gives a much higher death toll. It reports 296 at Ya Hoi High School, 299 at Đông Quang Tu Pagoda, 96 at Bai Yao, confirms Pike's number of 100 at Chợ Thông, confirms Pike's number of 201 at the Imperial Tombs, 250 at Doi Vọng Cánh, and 75 at Dom Ghi. It additionally describes some of the smaller graves of 25 villagers beheaded at Sa Hương Long district, 50 bodies at the An Ninh Hạ Bridge, 9 at the school in Yung Xuân Hạ village, 8 at Yung Xuân Thượng village, 30 at Long Thọ village, and 20 near Lang Sakon village. On March 14th, the 21st Arvin Rangers discovered 100 bodies on the coastline east of Huế while executing a sweep. These totals to at least 1,500 killed in the 8-kilometer radius of the city of Huế for the first wave of finds. Even with the disparity in numbers, both Pike and Dees reported that most of the victims were bound and gagged. Many of them were shot, but there was evidence that some had been killed by blunt objects or simply been buried to death, proven by their contorted postures and a lack of any body wounds. Some of the victims found in the graves were women, children, students, and foreigners. This included 4 French Catholic priests, 3 West German doctors, as well as 3 Koreans and a Hong Kong Chinese. Many of the victims were executed as family units. If an individual was on the list, then sometimes the immediate family would be rounded up to be executed as well. In one instance, a community leader, his wife, his married son and daughter-in-law, his young unmarried daughter, a male and female servant and their baby were killed. Even the pets were not left out. Their cat, dog, and goldfish were all killed as well. This was in line with the communal guilt doctrine of the communists. In the following year, during March and April of 1969, the second major wave of finds were made. Pike reports that 809 bodies were discovered in Hương Thủy and Phu Tu districts of Thừa Thiên province. Dees gives the details that 78 were found at Xuân Hòa village and 104 were found near Lê Sát Tây village. However, the majority of this wave of finds were found in the sand dunes along the coast of the province. 399 were found in 15 graves near Xuân Ổ and Yin Dai villages at the head of the sand dunes. 40 were found in one grave near the village of Lê Sát Đông in the middle of the dunes, and an additional 248 were found in 12 graves near Vĩnh Lưu village further south. Unfortunately, as the second wave of finds was made an entire year later, only 232 of these new bodies could be positively identified by relatives and claimed for private burial. The remainder were in such poor condition that they couldn't be identified. They were put into coffins, then buried by the Thừa Thiên provincial government. The Huế burials and mass graves were uncharacteristic for communist killings. Up until the Tet Offensive, communist executions were always precise, consistent, and doctrinal. They targeted disobedient village chiefs, government workers, civil servants, and teachers throughout the country to strike fear into the population of South Vietnam. The intent was to force villages and urban citizens into a state of insecurity, preventing them from relying on the South Vietnamese government for protection. To send a message, these executions were made very public. This time, the rationale for the killings at Huế was completely different. Douglas Pike asserts that tracing back the murders will show that these were not due to rage, frustration, or panic during the communist withdrawal, but rather they were methodical, as cadres with lists of names and addresses on clipboards appeared and called into kangaroo court various enemies of the revolution. They were explicitly hunting down government officials, civil servants, policemen, puppet soldiers, political party members, trade union leaders, prominent intellectuals, teachers, foreigners, and any other individuals recognized to support the South Vietnamese government. Execution squads would then round up individuals from these lists for processing. This was a true communist liquidation campaign. As a result, the bodies were buried to prevent people from discovering them. Fortunately, they were more easily discovered since creating massive burial sites in the middle of a large city is very difficult without being noticed by nearby civilians. But the burials make it clear, communist forces made major effort to hide their deeds. Due to the fear of possible reprisals once South Vietnamese and American forces would inevitably retake the city, or just to simply discard of the large number of bodies, the communists made every single attempt to hide these mass executions. While the graves in and around the city of Huế were more easily discovered, the burials ensured that some sites were very difficult to discover. The third major find would never have been discovered without a direct source. On June 26, 1969, Phạm Phước Nhung, former commander of an NLF local unit, rallied to the South Vietnamese government at Nam Hoa district under the Chiêu Hồi program. He testified to witnessing ad hoc people's courts being carried out and people being executed immediately after. With his testimony, an additional grave near Nguyệt View village of 5 bodies was discovered, along with another 16 bodies at a pagoda near the bank of the Da Tract River. He also stated that there was a much larger mass execution site associated with these two, but couldn't pinpoint the location. However, on September 19th and 20th, 2 additional former NLF guerrillas rallied to the government and confirmed Nhum's testimony of the last mass execution. Lê Liêm, a 19-year-old, directly passed by the site, and after witnessing the scale of death, resolved to change sides to the South Vietnamese government. He directly led district officials to the site via helicopter on September 21st. It was later called the Damai Creek Site. It would have never been discovered without his help. Damai Creek was covered by a double canopy and located in a very steep and narrow valley far from the nearby roads. The double canopy made it impossible to reach by land, and American 101st Airborne Engineers spent 2 days blasting a hole through the canopy by dangling dynamite on wires to create a landing pad. What they found were bones and skulls for almost 100 yards along the creek. At least 500 victims were identified at this site alone. A rough story for this incident was pieced together. During the first week of the Tet Offensive, the victims had gathered in the Phu Cam Catholic Church to escape the fighting. On the 5th day of Tet, communist cadres force-marched them to the pagoda and executed the initial group. The remainder were transferred around, waiting for re-education until they eventually reached the creek and killed en masse to eliminate witnesses. Eventually, 428 of the group were positively identified. They were then categorized. More than a quarter were military personnel. Students made another quarter, the majority of whom were primary or secondary schoolers, and a significant number of policemen, militiamen, and civil servants were also present. The remainder were private workers. Throughout all of the finds so far, it was clear that the initial victims were focused on individuals that showed any possible signs of loyalty to the government or apathy to the Liberation Front. Many were simply chosen because they appeared to be affluent business owners. However, in many of the later finds, especially the Damai Creek finds, the victims made a very even distribution of the South Vietnamese population. Hue citizens would eventually see these massacres as a specific attack on their city, while also being a communist liquidation campaign. As the seat of the final imperial dynasty of Vietnam, the Nguyen dynasty, Hue was the center of culture for much of traditional Vietnamese history. Southern Vietnam was newer and under firm French influence. Northern Vietnam had been constantly embroiled in multiple nationalist and communist uprisings, so traditional Vietnamese culture faded away. It was in the center that the old cultural mix of Buddhist, Confucian, Taoist Vietnamese culture was maintained. Hue became the center of religious and intellectual leadership and was the core of true Vietnamese tradition, whereas Saigon was the center of commerce and Hanoi the center of politics. It was possibly the fact that Hue still had much of its aristocratic, imperial, Confucian class structure that it became the target of communist massacres during the Tet Offensive. In November 1969, just 1 month after the Damai Creek discoveries, the last major wave of mass graves was uncovered around Phu Tu district and on Vinh Lop Island. These sites were not uncovered until a South Vietnamese rough puff operation was conducted to clear out the final pockets of NLF forces in the area. Civilians in Luong Bien fishing village finally felt secure enough to approach a regional force soldier to report the site on November 5th. Some of the villagers had been drafted to dig the trenches, and they kept the secret for an entire 20 months, fearing NLF reprisals if they reported to the government. 161 bodies were uncovered at what was later called the Salt Flat site. Other isolated graves were uncovered later on. 18 bodies found at Chom Ha village, and 19 bodies near An Lu village. On November 10th, South Vietnamese officials were led to the island of Vinh Lop by a captured NLF agent to a grave of 10 civilians. The island had been occupied from the start of Tet until September 1968, when an Allied operation forced the communists out. Unfortunately, because half of the island population of 52,000 fled during the communist occupation, as well as the random and scattered nature of the executions that took place during those 7 months, it was too chaotic to determine a clear number of victims on the island. A rough estimate of at least 100 executed on the island was made. These November sites, Phu Tu and Vinh Lop, would accumulate to an estimated total of about 230 to 300. Even then, in the same month of November 1969, another mass grave of 32 was discovered at Lê Sát Đài, a previous mass execution site. There was always the possibility of continuing to find graves in previously searched areas. Because of this, the extent of the executions could only be minimum counts at best. Up until the publishing of Pike's report in 1970, his total was 2,810 victims. The report on the communist political executions at Huế, most likely released after Pike's, brings the total up to 3,320 in a 17-kilometer radius around Huế. At some point, the South Vietnamese government released a list of 4,062 names of individuals massacred by the communists during Tết Mậu Thân. Unfortunately, it is not dated, and as most South Vietnamese government documents are still sealed, it is very difficult to verify. Considering the total number of unaccounted persons from the city of roughly 5,000, there are still around 2,000 missing individuals. Unfortunately, many will most likely never be accounted for, as the war only accelerated from 1970 onwards, disrupting any possibility for continued search. And with the collapse of the South Vietnamese government in 1975, no authority was willing to take any special effort to search for mass graves since. While the massacres were clearly documented and confirmed to have absolutely happened, the biggest tragedy of the incident is that they simply do not appear in the public consciousness when the topic of massacres or horror during the Vietnam War is brought up. The Mỹ Lai massacre takes that spot. While also horrible and should absolutely be condemned, it pales in comparison when it comes to scale. Pike, even in his report published 1970, just 2 years after the first finds, states on the Huế massacres that apparently it made no impact on the world's mind or conscience, for there was no agonized outcry, no demonstrations at North Vietnamese embassies around the world. In a tone beyond bitterness, the people there will tell you that the world does not know what happened in Huế, or, if it does not care. Even in a 2018 New York Times opinion piece, professional historian Olga Dror commented that the My Lai victims and the American perpetrators pushed the Huế victims and the communist perpetrators out of the American media and, by extension, out of the attention of the American public and of world opinion. She concludes that unlike the My Lai massacre, which is mentioned in most general books about the war and is analyzed in dozens of specialized books published from the 1970s to the present, the events in Huế have not received any serious study and have largely, if not completely, faded from American memory and scholarship. She reached the exact same conclusion Pike did almost 50 years earlier. Perhaps the biggest tragedy of the Huế massacres of 1968 is that the biggest tragedy of the war is not known as the biggest tragedy of the war.